Good morning. Welcome to Instytut Następny Think Tank and New Books Network. Today is my great honor to welcome Dr. Janusz Emre Ozigci. He's a head of department at Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Turkey. For a very long time, Dr. Ozigci spent in Nairobi in Africa, where he tried to pursue the interests of Turkish Republic. And on the private note, he's an interesting IR scholar who definitely tries to incept philosophy into the science of international relations. We've collaborated for quite some time, and it's an honor and privilege to host you today. Good afternoon. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you very much for your kind words. And the honor is all mine, in fact. And I have been always honored with our collaboration, and I look forward to continue, of course, with it. Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Schack.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And today we meet to discuss most probably the most anticipated book of 2026, which will be released in March 2026. The title of this book is NATO's Meaning and Existence. And I guess that it will take the policymaking community by storm because your analytical proofs in policymaking and diplomatic pursuits resonate with credible strategic insights. We are very lucky to have you here, and I hope that I will promote your book because I read it. It's incredible. To allow NATO and the policymaking world to overcome its Heideggerian phase of throwingness in the words, and I guess this is its main purpose. Dr. Ozigci, could you tell me more about yourself?
Also, but with your permission, Dr. Peter Schack, I need for one moment fulfill the rational obligation. During this interview, the views I will voice are strictly personal and will reflect my personal work. Therefore, they will not reflect official views of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs at all, and they will bind only my person. Returning to the first question about myself. Well, I'm an ordinary man and ordinary diplomat with an ordinary life routine. Served in a number of countries abroad and a number of departments at home. Nothing really spectacular. However, I have a strange interest in international relations. This interest is not confined to the practice or to specific theoretical constructs and narratives. It extends to what makes theories and the act of theorizing possible. It extends to the ontology of the lived reality of the field of international relations. This has characterized my master's and doctoral studies before, and then my publications. Ultimately, my aim is to find a viable way to return in Husserl's work and methodically to the things themselves as they appear in their pre-narrative forms. In the field of international relations, these things themselves are the immediate, intersubjective, universal, pre-theoretical appearances, givennesses of entities and their interactions, which otherwise do not exist with an objectivity in the narrow sense of the term. but which are still integrated to causality and thus expand reality which we live within.
Thank you for that. There's nothing ordinary about that for sure. Could you tell me what led you to the idea behind the NATO's meanings and existence within the interstate intersubjectivity?
Well, to be honest, it was first the need to anchor my studies of international relations to a suitable content that would that could provide me with a vantage point. Because since it's coming into being, NATO has been one of the most prominent IR entities on which the study of the interstate environment, general interstate environment, could be centered. It's a sui generis, highly institutionalized interstate alliance, and at the same time, a central institution of a specific system determining security community. It's a product of the act of community building attributed to states which appear immediately and intersubjectively as subjects of the IR field. Additionally, NATO is a constituent part of, or was a constituent part of two consecutive environments of interstate interactions, which we name bipolarity and post-bipolarity or unipolarity. Therefore, studying NATO's identity and temporality is also studying the substances and temporal courses of two international systems or structures and their major actors. So NATO was perhaps the most suitable content on which I could anchor my own approach to international relations. Hence, NATO's meaning and existence.
Thank you very much for that. Is that the reason why you approach NATO from different perspectives, not like any other IR thinker? You basically you use your philosophical insights into explaining many things. Does it help you, basically?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I try to study NATO and I try to study any IR entity, event, phenomenon, state of affairs
Mhm.
on the basis of its, as I said, pre-theoretical, immediate, and intersubjective original appearance, givenness. In other words, as they universally appear and presented to intersubjective recognition in the first place. I seek to approach this original state of being, of givenness, since it provides also any secondary reflective act, any theoretical effort and construct with its main inevitable reference and content. The givenness, the original intersubjectively meaningful and the immediately recognized appearance of the study object, once it is reached and described, displays a horizon of possibilities for subsequent theoretical acts and individual or collective bestowal of meanings. On this fundamental reference, on this referential basis, these secondary acts and appearances, theoretical efforts, constructs, may also be studied and put into perspective as to their own givenness linked to this basic existential reference. Such an approach is necessary due to the very nature of theorizing in the IR field, in my opinion, because it's different from the spheres of theorizing in positive and social sciences. Within the sphere of positive sciences, the act of theorizing has an irrefutable objectivity anchor. It's the independent, self-standing presence of the study object within the material reality. Such presence, well, may only be contested by the solution, but it can be compartmentalized and well, it's intrinsically neutral. Within the sphere of positive sciences, based on this between quotas irrefutable materiality of study objects, these study objects are accessible by all as they are, and any theoretical effort and construct within this field can be assessed independently, but on the same material basis. Within the field of social sciences, the study objects, of course, are not often self-standingly present in the material reality, but they are direct subjects, which are individuals and their groups are there and reachable within objectivity, and their relations and behavior patterns can be directly accessed as they make part of the objectivity in its narrow sense, with the same effects of independent assessment on irrefutable basis. But the IR field is different. No one has ever seen a state or an international organization. No one has ever seen a NATO. No one has ever seen even an IR event or a state of affairs in simple objectivity as they are originally defined and understood. What we directly and objectively experience within the field are things, events, states of affairs that are related to these intersubjective appearances through links of representation and co-presentation of presentation together, such as true persons as decision makers, specific groups in their specific behavioral patterns and relations as institutions, even the specific buildings, those symbols, buildings like this very building, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as representers and presenters of the state. and so forth. Here, in contrast to the general field of social sciences, these persons and groups, decision makers, bureaucrats, are not even IR subjects themselves. They, as I said, present and represent the appearance of direct IR subjects, which are mainly the states. They gain these true subjects, their meaningfulness from them, and states as subjects are intersubjectively and immediately given and referred to as self-standing entities, as if they made part of material reality. This state of affairs is questioned only a posteriori, not immediately, questioned through a secondary theoretical attitude. Well, remember what Alfred Schutz had said about the referral to states as subjects, a grammatical phenomenon. But even this proposal, secondary proposal, referred to the prior fact of referral to state as subject. Within the IR field, what we originally have are appearances, meanings, collective meaning attributions, without a direct anchor in objectivity, in contrast to positive sciences and social sciences area. These appearances and meanings are, of course, collectively constituted by true subjects like you and me. Their universal recognition indicates the presence of an intersubjective stratum of reality, which is not but akin to objectivity. It is valid for anyone and everyone before any reflective act. Yet, the same true subjects, like you and me, we perceive, judge, feel, remember, anticipate, and more importantly, we theorize about these collective constitutions in our own ways, within a horizon of possibilities, referring to and stemming from this intersubjective recognition, prior intersubjective recognition of otherwise non-existent things, which form what we call the IR field. Still, the lack of a solid anchor in simple material objectivity in this field liberates the theoretical effort, perhaps too much. When the theoretical effort in the field tends to alter or replace, by re-explaining, elements of the intersubjective stratum dimensioned, when it produces its own axioms, a priori proposals about the substance of the otherwise already appearing things and interactions, theorizing in the IR field evolves toward building frameworks of alternative realities. Such frameworks within the study are imposed upon the prior, preceding, immediate, intersubjective appearances of the study objects of the IR and pose a risk of distorting them in substance, but also in temporality, since the IR theorizing in particular tends to begin in its approach to its study objects, tends to begin with a genetic narrative, a narrative of its objects coming into being. But quite often, the study is related to the post-genetic, current, or future givenness of its study object, not related to its moment of coming into being. But this genetic narrative has to be imposed uh, upon the study object in another, already in another temporal state. This does not mean that IR theories are necessarily wrong, inaccurate, etc. But there is this ontological risk of distortion and the risk of emergence during the study's temporal course related to its study object. So the study of NATO has been done, of course, is not different. And I do not work on NATO or any other study object of mine like that. I instead employ the useful aspects of, as you mentioned, phenomenology, Husserl's phenomenology, and Heidegger's, let's say, phenomenological ontology, to anchor my study to things themselves, to their original state of being. Well, in the case of this book, to NATO as it has been, is, and could be in its immediate intersubjective, pre-theoretical, meaningful appearance in different temporal states. I use bracketing, of course, bracketing theoretical acts and constructs and other secondary reflective efforts, trying to avoid the risk of distortion I have mentioned. But this is the sense of putting them into perspective and referring them as such, not at all attempting to erase them, delete.
Thank you much for that. Basically, philosophy requires from you to adopt a different type of thinking. And Heidegger, in particular, he was very keen on his concept of throwingness into the world. And I guess NATO after 2022 experiences these dilemmas, which are basically throwingness into the world, not knowing what is happening, not knowing how to react. And Heidegger is a huge part of your project. So could you tell me, how do you interpret him? How do you use his insights into explaining different aspects of NATO, which is not NATO of 1989 or NATO of 1991, but NATO in 2026?
Mhm. Well, before trying to answer in detail, you are right, in fact. But perhaps I should try to dwell on how I do see Martin Heidegger, because
Mhm.
he's one of the fundamental references in my work, one of the two fundamental references in my work. Well, I employ Heidegger very selfishly, I will say, and to apply Heideggerian phenomenological ontology, pop, pop, is, on the one hand, a selfish application, but a little bit, well, more on the ontological side. Let me explain. My approach and method, to begin with, bracketing, epoche, include as main concepts, first and foremost, the Husserlian concepts. Intersubjectivity, intentionality, temporality. These are main references to Husserlian phenomenology to describe the collective and continuing constitution of states, immediately and intersubjectively appearing as subjects in their interactions. However, as fundamental reference of mine, Husserlian phenomenology has its own problems, particularly when we try to adapt it to IR studies. For example, intersubjectivity is related in Husserl with the particular experience of the existence of other, which displays the irreducibility of the other to mindness, to allness, which is called empathy, and is in self-debatable. Or apart from this, in his later work, Crisis, Husserl had described intersubjectivity and the word phenomenon as part of the subject's sphere of allness, in contrast, therefore, in presence of specific experiences, but as a sort of heritage of prior social interactions, social communication. In terms of temporality, also there's a problem. The temporalization of experience is separated between different intentional acts, and they were mostly confined to perception. But Heidegger is useful because he defines these fundamental concepts of the study and of my study within the existential structure of Dasein is inherent to its being world. In this sense, it's not surprising to see that Heidegger thinks that Husserlian intentionality, for example, is very fragmentary, makes temporalizations also fragmentary. And I think that intersubjectivity's foundation, social communication, indicates a relapse to the complications of theorizing in Husserl, and it becomes something akin to more ontological and rigorous constructivism in the IR field. Heidegger's display of intersubjectivity, intentionality, and temporality, which are central to my work also, within Dasein's existential structure, and as inseparable from each other, is indispensable. It corrects the Husserlian fragmentation and Husserlian relapses into theorizing of what is already there theoretically. On the other hand, Husserl's phenomenology is, solidly methodical. It seeks to establish philosophy as a rigorous science, in fact, primary science, and I need this approach in my study as well. Therefore, I need to employ Heidegger and Husserl in tandem, not with absolute fidelity to both or to one of them. Because my work, this may seem quite weird to a philosopher, as you know, to work in tandem with Husserl and Heidegger, who are very different, in fact. But it is practicable in our study, in our context, because my work is related to states, which are collectively constituted by true subjects, through the attribution of some subject-like Dasein-like features, like limited within context intentionality, grasp of intersubjectivity, interactionality, and temporality. They present as such their post-genetic immediacy, and they make part of the lived reality. They are integrated into lived causality. Although Husserlian and Heideggerian approaches differ very much in their dealing with the ego subject on the one hand, and Dasein for Heidegger, they do converge when the study objects are the appearances of these derivative subjects, states, with subject-like or Dasein-like features, which are limitedly attributed to them, with attributed acts of their own, including their own attributed community building acts, as in the example of NATO. And speaking of Heidegger and your question on these days about the existential, current existential problem of NATO, well, in my opinion, it may be considered the risk of its member states shift to inauthenticity in Heideggerian terms, or more clearly, their shift to denial of authenticity. NATO meaningfully exists, authentically exists, only with a thesis. A thesis composed of norms, values, practices of a Weltanschauung among its constituent states, member states. Without this thesis, NATO is but a simple multipolar era-like alliance with no tangible foundation other than ad hoc circumstances. But states are constituted subject-like entities. They are originally authentic. In the first place, they are authentic because they are constituted entities, unlike true Dasein, true subject. Their community building, well, these are acts of authentic entities, already authentic entities. Or, as you know, in Heidegger, authenticity is something Dasein is towards. Dasein's everydayness is mostly inauthentic. It's different for these constituted subjects, named states. If, well, NATO reflects authenticity, therefore, of its constituents, which is the convergence of its constituent states on a thesis, common thesis. And if this convergence is being today significantly weakened, first by avoiding defending in deeds the thesis effectively, visibly, and second by politically and discursively self-distancing from the thesis itself, it becomes possible to speak of a genuinely existential problem, if not as yet of an existential crisis, but certainly of a genuine existential problem. And
So as long as we
Mhm.
remain true to our mission in NATO, the authenticity may be preserved in that case, as long as we will fulfill our obligation. Uh, what I wonder, because there's many IR theoreticians and many thinkers who don't feel that philosophy is important nowadays, but our founding fathers, such as Hans Morgenthau, he's basically he thrived because of philosophy, because of his knowledge of Nietzsche, because of his knowledge of Machiavelli, Kant. Because of that, he came up with these brilliant ideas of national interest and preservation of states and so on and so forth. I like the fact that you relate Heidegger to the current basically issues which this organization faces, and I also like the fact that you are following up on a very interesting tradition, because it's not only Heidegger, it's not only Morgenthau, but also Kenneth Waltz structuralism, Hadley Bull's existential security. They all take something from these philosophical insights. They all try to use philosophy to explain certain changing aspects of global environment. And I just wonder what's closer to your heart. Is it structural realism or English school in this particular instance?
No, you mean Waltz or Teddy Bull, for
Or
example.
both of them
Mhm.
combined?
Mhm. Well, you already know that Waltz structural realism is particularly important in my work, current work, and other
Mhm.
publications. Walt's systemic approach and concept of polarity. Structural realism provides my studies indeed with a very useful framework and elements to in order to be able to describe the general intersubjective environment of interstate interactions at a given time, the context of it, the general appearance, givenness of it. This does not mean that I agree with Kenneth Waltz's theoretical construct in its entirety. In fact, I disagree in particular with this selective narrowing of parameters of interstate interactions to predefined selected aspects, narrated aspects of power and power relations. The world separates, the state subjects own individualities as they are given, and which consist of other elements besides their relative power, from not from the analysis of foreign policies, the very interesting short article, but from the systemic study. These individualities often define the state sector's, yes, policy directions, particularly in terms of alignments. And as such, they also build the system, the structure, in contrast with Walt's approach. The complications of IR theorizing that I have mentioned earlier are therefore valid for structural realism as well. But realism and structural realism, you mentioned Hans Morgenthau in connection with Friedrich Nietzsche. It's very interesting, very right, in my opinion, for some aspects. But realism and structural realism do assume the state's original appearance, givenness, as a subject. This de facto assumption, or perhaps omission to comment on that, instead of narrating states as social constructs while privileging some dynamics, identities, norms, beliefs, ideologies, practices, so forth. This assumption is very valuable, for it is linked, in my opinion, to the immediate pre-theoretical, pre-reflective, intersubjective appearance of the states. This assumption in realism and structural realism holds throughout the theoretical effort, the entire theoretical effort, and the theoretical narrative here does not suppress, eliminate this assumption of substance. It only tries to explain it a posteriori, thus confining its possible distortive effect to an ulterior level, which can be more easily bracketed and put into perspective. This contrasts, for example, to constructivism, which narrates intersubjectivity and intersubjective substance themselves. Thus, the structural realist polarity as the expression of the general interstate environment has an inherent intersubjective validity ground, which precedes structural realist explanation which comes after. So structural realism, in particular of Waltz, is with reserves very important for me. Even more important than the constructivism, that some had the wrongly, in fact, had drawn some parallelisms with my work, between my work and constructivism. Regarding the English scholar Bull's existential security concept, it's also very valuable because it underlines individualities of states, individualities as their existential basis. But then Bull also proceeds to narrate the concept of security, for example, linked to the concept of subordination earlier, and in the later works, protectorates, speaking of Europe, in a subjective direction, secondary direction, therefore risking theoretical distortion in substance and temporality of the study objects. This risk becomes even heavier with his narrative of international society, the societal order, based on but this is the case, in my opinion, subjective leaning, the selective narrative of his parameters, which are what they are: war, diplomacy, responsibility of major powers, balance of power, law, in fact, international. Well, after all, both are, of course, valuable, very useful, very contributing, illuminating indeed. And both approaches require being submitted to bracketing before they also display the IR theories omission of the existential basis of what they study.
Thank you much for that, Dr. Ozigci. Could you tell me, from your perspective, what's the main problem with our methods in IR theory? Can we actually use our theories to address tomorrow's problems? Because the theory is somehow not as applicable sometimes to explain various global circumstances, global issues at hand.
Nothing is wrong and everything is wrong,
Mhm.
in my humble opinion. It's not about yesterday's or tomorrow's problems or circumstances in the first place. Theorizing in the field of international relations to avoid misunderstanding is necessary and is inevitable, of course, since the act of theorizing is basically systematical thinking within a specific field on specific study objects, problems, appearances, and it's about building a viable structure for thought for approaching these study objects to conduct the study. However, as I tried to outline, the international relations field has no self-standing, directly accessible objective anchor, neither in terms of its objects, events, states of affairs, nor in terms of its apparent direct subjects, mostly states. They are all intersubjective and collective constructions that make objectively observable events and entities otherwise meaningful in a different manner of their presence in the material objective, the material reality, such as a clash between an armed clash between the two groups of people gains meaning from its representation and a representation of an event of war. Otherwise, we do not see, we never see war as is in material objective. We see the clashes, the material thing. But appearing in another, more comprehensive, more profound meaning. Does these things, we have these things influence, enrich, expand reality that we collectively live? Once these things appear, they offer, present substance and temporality, which is akin to self-standing objective things. So they do not need to be made to exist again and again in a certain fashion. They are already there as part of reality, as they are pre-theoretically, immediately, intersubjectively given. Now, the IR theories, they basically tend to create anchors in their approach to them instead of trying to reach the already present, intersubjectively anchored appearances as they already are as such. Creating anchors means creating, as I said, axioms, a priori proposals, in order to narrate the study object's genesis and to apply the narrative framework to their otherwise immediate intersubjective appearances. So it is not surprising that numerous and often conflicting theoretical structures coexist in the field of IR. I remember Tanguy Struye, a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain, and he was a member of my jury for the PhD, had once described this situation, not with these exact words, but the gist of it, as the presence of newer neo-neos of whatsoeverisms, which is indeed the case. And we still tend to multiply theoretical variants instead of thinking about the ontology of our study objects within the IR field, which is otherwise very much latent and rich. So yesterday's theories, textbooks are very suitable, in fact, for the study of the IR phenomena, events, entities, because they bring forth many useful concepts to refer to and to express the phenomena encountered within the field. They cannot totally cut their bonds with the original intersubjective immediate givennesses of the study objects. They are always linked somehow to them, even in alteration. I myself gladly used the structural realist polarity concept, for example, or also the notion of security community extensively in my work, among others. On the other hand, they are not, these theories, entirely suitable and will not be so tomorrow, as long as they consist of the researcher's own narrative based on researcher's own axioms. Well, due to the nature of the IR field, their nature of the IR field, which is different even from that of the social sciences in general, I think we do need philosophy, ontology, as a matter of fact. And but otherwise, Husserl and Heidegger are not gurus and prophets, and they, as you know very well, they originally have nothing to do with higher studies. And the state is neither a subject itself or Dasein, but an entity co-constituted by true subjects as subject-like, Dasein-like things in a restricted, limited way. But Husserl and Heidegger, as I said earlier, in tandem, are very useful to find a method to return to things themselves to the pre-theoretical, original, and valid state of being of our study objects, to reach the intersubjective stratum of lived reality, the intentional index in Husserlian terms of true subjects, to which our context is anchored.
Leaving ontology for a bit, There is a prevailing opinion in the policymaking world that NATO experiences some difficulties and existential problems, as a matter of fact, also because of its current leadership, the crisis of current leadership. How would philosopher explain what is going on under the current leadership?
Hmm. With the current leadership, you mean the Secretary General and
Exactly.
his team, the Rutte. Hmm. So the decision maker and bureaucrat. Well, the leadership means decision maker and the team of bureaucrats. Well, the decision maker or the bureaucrat had, had well, this is a true subject who is integrated into an institution or a state subject which it represents and uppresents in his or her acts. The decision makers or the bureaucrats' acts occur within the existential framework of what the decision maker bureaucrat represents and presents at a level that is at a level of embodiment with the entity which is pre-assigned and visible in his or her title. This does not mean that the bureaucrat or decision maker is irrelevant or unimportant. This does not mean that the decision maker is devoid of his or her own individuality, individual being either. However, the body, the institution that is represented and represented must and will precede and determine this true subject's acts within a horizon of possibilities. The decision maker's acts are enabled, conditioned, and restrained by the very institution entity within its own interactional horizon, let us say. Therefore, NATO may appear to display, to have success, brilliance, or failures, shortcomings under one or another leader, bureaucrat. And the bureaucrat may have indeed a substantial role in it, individual and substantial role in it. But what NATO is the convergence, basically the convergence of its state members appearing as subjects at a given time and within a given interactional setup of other actors will constitute the a priori here. So I am interested in my work exactly on that. So not the leadership, be it Rutte, Stoltenberg, who was before Stoltenberg, Rasmussen, or someone else, who were by nature secondary to NATO itself. And NATO in turn is secondary to its state members. So NATO is never in its leadership's hands, but in the hands of the actuality of interstate intersubjectivity and state subjects in interaction.
Thank you much for that. That's a very interesting response to my provocative question. Uh, can you tell me, from your perspective, what continental philosophy can offer to redefine NATO's role in today's ever-changing geostrategic landscape through a profound philosophical inquiry to comprehend the problems of the transition from the unipolar to multipolar momentum?
Oh, well, I see. First about the continental philosophy. Well, it is necessary, continental philosophy, at least a part of it, to be able to grasp, comprehend NATO within the environment of interstate interactions, not only of today, but also of yesterday, and always within an anticipatory horizon, a horizon of possibility related to future, tomorrow. We need to go beyond the constant risk of complications of the current IR theorizing without discarding the IR theorizing. For this, we need some specific parts of the continental philosophy, because we need to anchor in this context our study of NATO, but also of any IR event, entity, phenomenon, to its original givenness, intersubjectively recognized original givenness. This original givenness is, after all, so numerous IR theories on fundamental references, because in narrating or even in distorting, you need the presence of something to narrate, something to distort. In the extreme case, as parts of continental philosophy, let us say, phenomenology and always phenomenological ontology become useful here. They serve to bracket, put into perspective, display, while correcting each other. In fact, Heidegger corrects Husserl. Not only the study object, specific study object, but also the levels and mechanisms of meaningfully constituting them, attributing meaning to them as collective appearances, including states as derived derivative subjects, and their communities, like NATO. So redefining NATO, therefore, continental philosophy is useful to try effectively to reach to what NATO theoretically was, currently is, and may become. It's not about defining and redefining its role according to our preferences. It's about what it is in its different temporal states. And in my view, well, NATO was the sui generis alliance and security community institution within a systemic dialectic, bipolarity. It was an alliance, before all, a muscle, led by a Pole, but built upon the convergence of a number of state actors. Convergence which was strictly bound to the presence of a thesis, which was confronted by an antithesis. The antithesis in its counter-muscle, Warsaw Pact, collapsed at a given time. NATO became otherless, despite its own original state of being, and then seemed to have entered into an ontological limbo, and many thought that it was the end of its rope. It indeed became more of an institution of a security community than an alliance, which was against a symmetrical, systemic alliance. But it remained in place because, in my humble opinion, its alliance identity was temporalized on the anticipatory future horizon due to the possibility of the re-emergence of a symmetrical systemic opponent. Well, it continued to represent the thesis, therefore the convergence of its state members, through muscle still visible in interventions of the earlier unipolar times, and attraction also, which is visible in NATO's enlargement. The muscle side was, however, diminished relative to NATO's original environment, bipolarity, I mean. And the convergence seemingly became more flexible and, how to say, weaker. And when a symmetrical, or at least quasi-symmetrical, opponent emerged, NATO's seemingly weakened convergence, constituent convergence, reacted only slowly, clumsily, postponingly. Yes, during the 2008 NATO Bucharest summit, you will remember the map issues. It seems that the alliance identity faced to opposition had been preserved too long in a mothballed state. And when this opposition stiffened, became aggressive or more determined, and when the actualization of the original alliance identity of NATO became obligatory, perhaps, bringing also heavy burdens for state members, we saw that the constitutive convergence of its state subjects had weakened too much, and the thesis itself, the norms, identities, values, Weltanschauung, practices, had become quite fragile, even perhaps partially discarded. Now, will it be truly discarded? We will see. But this is the very meaningful ground of NATO's existence and everything it represents. You mentioned, however, something, the transition to a multipolar order, from unipolarity to multipolarity, I understand. Well, let us see if such process will be completed. Its completion, the transition to multipolarity, however, in my humble opinion, requires any thesis to become at least non-systemic, to be confined to the individualities of this or that state subject or lesser communities of them. Because the multipolar era, which occupied, well, a great majority of what we call, the major part of what we call history, had no thesis, systemic thesis, to define the structure and system and interstate convergences at that level. So international norms existed then, but were not effectively backed by the convergences among the states. However, the multipolar order to which we are supposed to be transiting is being understood by many and presented so as an environment where international law, international institutions like the UN would have a relative preponderance, more respect in a more egalitarian way. But I do not know if we do even need philosophy, continental philosophy, to remember the multipolar times, and even in multipolar periods where international norms were very fashionable, such as the era of the Concert of Europe and of the League of Nations. I don't know if we need continental philosophy even to have an idea about the nature of what we call now the multipolar international order.
Thank you for that. We basically covered so far lots of thoughts related to Husserl, Hegel, Heidegger. But how about Kant, Derrida, Habermas? How would they approach the changing nature of today's NATO?
Well, Kant, you have said, Habermas, Derrida, right?
Yes, Levinas.
Levinas, let us begin with Kant. What would he think about NATO in particular?
In particular.
Well, Kant, I think he could see NATO as an intermediary stage between the state of nature, but international state of nature, and the idealized Völkerbund, in fact. Because, well, of the nature of its thesis, of the thesis it represents. He could think that NATO would might help to establish a liberal, between quotas, liberal rule of law, which would be anathema to despotic, arbitrary tendencies. It could serve to increase, it was very much interested in interactions between peoples and states and ensure or help progress towards a perpetual peace. But he could see NATO as an obstructing factor too, on this line of progress from state of nature to vagabond, because he could think that NATO is an exclusive club, and
That's for sure.
mhm, some elements of even some elements of the thesis, the Weltanschauung, and related policies of NATO or represented through NATO is oppressive, imposing, not only in the physical interventions, but through attraction as well, which would undermine the very spirit of an idealized Völkerbund, because well, Kant sees Völkerbund as a successful version of the League of Nations, mostly. But Kant would in fact support the NATO members, constituent members, convergent discourse and Weltanschauung as expressed. But as he would see NATO also as an obstructing factor, well, he could also support the elements of Russian criticism of NATO. But Levinas, you mentioned, Levinas, when he hypothetically puts NATO, of course, it will be based on the ethos, ethics of grasping and interacting with the other. No? It will be prominent. You could see NATO as an entity, perhaps, serving to totalize and possible or actual other in the face of itself as opponent. Even NATO could be seen for him as something which would serve to dehumanize, deform the other as opponent, even despite its own liberal, progressive-looking discourse and thesis. And perhaps he could criticize NATO for constituting an attempt to reduce to uniformity, to sameness of its own member states. Could be. You mentioned Derrida. Derrida talked about the NATO, the ones you should remember, the Kosovo crisis, right? Therefore, he would see NATO's post-bipolar evolution perhaps as a series of autoimmune acts, also caused, thrown at it by the dilemmas which stemmed from the international environment's circumstances. But in Kosovo crisis, during the crisis, he had talked about such a dilemma of acting, intervening, and not acting, not intervening in Kosovo, right? So not acting, not intervening, would be catastrophic. It would contradict to the very existence of NATO, undermine the thesis itself, which made NATO meaningful and maintained as meaningful. But acting would also undermine other parameters, also fundamental parameters, which NATO and its state members supported, which is international law, right? Principle of sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference. So it would be an autoimmune situation. In both cases, whatever the choice would be. He would, I suspect, for example, NATO enlargement as another such dilemma with autoimmune acts and results. That he would not, I think, reject the necessity of that for example, NATO enlargement, but that would not prevent him to see that necessary act of responsiveness to the European countries' willingness to join NATO. It would not prevent him to see these necessary steps also as autoimmune because it steered, encouraged, or made obligatory, I don't know, the stiffening of a systemic opposition. Could be. But this is Derrida, right?
Bravo. Amazing. Thank you much for that insights. This is very rewarding to our listeners for sure. Considering all of the issues which we covered and all of the dimensions of NATO which you covered in your book, what would be your recommendation, your personal recommendation on how NATO can win cognitive wars against Russia and China in the 21st century?
It is counseling the prince. I won't do that, but cognitive war you mentioned. Yeah. Well, NATO, let me give the clumsy diplomatic answer. The first, NATO cannot win a cognitive war struggle if there is to be any such struggle. Its member states can, in their own convergence on NATO. It's important to state here that NATO is not a simple interstate alliance like those during the multipolarity, for example, but an alliance that was originated, as I said, by bipolarity, by the central dialectic of bipolarity's international structure of them. NATO was an alliance that was not therefore simply an expression of balance of power, but an alliance and an institution of a security community with a firm thesis, a Weltanschauung, and a very real, strong and immediate antithesis. Well, NATO's thesis appeared to have, of course, prevailed during the terminal phase of bipolarity and the earlier phase of unipolarity, which ensued it. But for some time, yes, the fundamental thesis which made NATO exist meaningfully has very much been contested. And not by a bipolarity-like antithesis, which would be a tetic structure equivalent to what it contradicted. But it has been contested by a very strong, admittedly, reactionary stance. So this is not a dialectic in terms of bipolarity. And in my opinion, the question is about this struggle, cognitive struggle. The question is whether the convergence of NATO member states will halt and halt with the thesis or not. The answer is within NATO, within the member states of NATO. Otherwise, I do recommend nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So the counseling, the prince, as I said, well, it's not my place, and certainly not my intention, not the aim of my work. I'm even disinterested. And in Husserlian terms, the indifferent spectator. And I will remain an indifferent spectator.
Dr. Ozigci, thank you much for that. Could you tell us about your future plans? What's future holds for you in 2026?
Oh, happiness and richness, but no, this will not happen. We are living in the real world. I need to continue to write,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Peterson. Well, the use of phenomenology and phenomenological ontology in the IR studies is, well, is in need of being further and further refined. And there's much work to do in this direction, both fortunately and unfortunately. Unfortunately, because, well, this indicates also, a double life in terms of work for myself. I have already a job, and thanks to it, I'm able to pay the bills. Well, I may consider a change. Seriously, we'd like to strengthen the life course for myself. I don't know, perhaps I will find something conducive to a radical change, or perhaps something will find me, I don't know. But in any case, no need to complain much. I've been able to manage so far. Well, I shouldn't be able to manage this during this year as well.
Fingers
We shall
crossed.
see.
Fingers crossed for all of your initiatives, both academic and diplomatic. Thank you very much for your time on behalf of New Books Network and Instytut Następny Think Tank. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you very much, Dr.
And to our readers, I strongly recommend you NATO Meanings and Existence within the Interstate Intersubjectivity. It is book which will be available from March 2026 onwards. Thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.